feel like I want to call out the long timers in water in the Deschutes. John, Dave, Ellen. If you've worked in the Deschutes for over 20 years in water, raise your hand. I nailed it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Is that sounds all good, Matt? All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. And happy World Water Day. I believe that is tomorrow. So you're here to celebrate with us tonight. We're super grateful there's so many of you that care about water. My name's Kate Fitzpatrick. I'm the executive director of the Deschutes River Conservancy. Our mission is to restore stream flow and water quality to the Deschutes Basin using collaboration and consensus. We want to take a moment and honor the Native people who have called this region home for thousands of years. We join them in stewardship for the next 7 generations and beyond. I also want to thank our sponsors tonight, City of Bend, Mount Bachelor, and Sun Country Tours. I can't see with my long glasses on. Hand in Hand Productions, Open Space Event Studio, Patagonia, Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, Mount Bachelor Rotary Club of Bend, and Wanderlust Tours. We're going to dive right in tonight. I am going to start with a bad joke. What do you call a sad frog? Unhappy. So I should stop doing this. Okay, well, that's a good segue to our panelists, our presenters tonight, because what we're talking about is how we're trying to make frogs happy and rivers happy in the Deschutes Basin while sustaining agriculture. And you'll hear all about this. So I'm going to go ahead and present our presenters. Lisa Seals, many of you are familiar with. She's our brilliant moderator of the conversation. She has a PhD in the social science of water and is a program manager at the DRC. A little known fact about Lisa. She's always seen with a green smoothie and popcorn at lunch. I don't know that she eats anything other than popcorn for lunch. So I have yet to see it. And then our sort of main event tonight is Bridget Moran. She is the field supervisor for the Bend office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She is leading the development of the Habitat Conservation Plan currently being implemented in the Deschutes River Basin, and she advises the DRC on habitat and species needs. She's a member of the DRC board. She's worked in fish and wildlife conservation for 20 years in Oregon, Washington, and probably other places. She's from New York City, but don't blame her for that. It's actually part of what makes her an amazing negotiator. And she's a fantastic translator of really complex ideas, and I think you'll see that tonight. Bridget is also an avid skier, and she's a keyboardist in a rock band. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa for tonight's event. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. So I love to do this at the beginning of all the Raise the Deschutes seminars, but I'm curious how many of you have attended a seminar before this evening? So show of hands. Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much, those of you that have not, and those of you that continue to return to the Raise the Deschutes seminar series to learn about water in our basin. We are so grateful to have you all here, and really, we wouldn't do it without you. So thanks for coming. So before we get going on tonight's topic, I just want to do a little bit of a rehashing of history, which we've talked about in prior seminars, but just as a good reminder of kind of how we got to where we are today, right? So, a couple hundred years ago, this area was resettled by non-tribal folks who arrived with the imperative of making the land productive, largely by diverting water from waterways to lands for farming. Like that is essentially, there were acts that were passed, and that's how we encouraged settlement of the entire Western United States. So that is essentially how we all ended up here and how we got where we are today with the situations that we are dealing with in the Deschutes Basin. So to continue a little bit in the rehashing of where we are and how we got here, some of you have seen this graphic before, but this is basically showing the Deschutes River. Wickiup is at the top, and Lake Billy Chinook is at the bottom. And on the left of the graphic, you have what happens in the winter with the Deschutes River. And on the right, you have what happens in the summer. And this is essentially the diversion and storage of water to meet all the other purposes in the basin, largely agriculture, but also municipal uses as well. So as you can see, you've got winter flows are being held back in Wickiup Reservoir to store water that is then released in the summertime. So those flows go way up in the summer. So way down in the winter and way up in the summer. And this is in contrast to how the Deschutes River used to function before we built Wickiup Reservoir and started storing and diverting water. And that is that the Deschutes River was one of the most stable flowing rivers, I think, in the world, because we are not dependent on, the flashiness of snowmelt and rain events. Instead, the Deschutes River is very much fed by groundwater. It's fed by springs, and those springs are discharging sort of the same amount of water no matter whether it's November or July. So before we started storing and diverting water, we had a really stable hydrograph, right? The hydrograph is basically time on the bottom, river flow is on the x-axis. The blue is sort of the natural flow. You'll see that it didn't go up a whole lot, or I should say up or down. But then again, showing the graphic before, we have now, to serve human purposes, we have started really messing with the hydrograph. So now we have this altered hydrograph. So that is, in essence, kind of how we got where we are today. And this is, this is not pointing fingers at all, but this is just explaining the situation, and we've all greatly benefited from it. We all eat, we all have great homes to live in, warm water coming out of our taps, but it is not without impacts. So, and that's the work of the DRC and the partnerships that we have, is to try to kind of help restore the situation. So that's my little history lesson. So without further ado, we're gonna dive into what we actually came here to talk about tonight, which is endangered species, and specifically the Habitat Conservation Plan, and what that really what that means, and how it's impacting the basin and water management. So to take a big picture step back, let's just talk a little bit about, everybody's probably all heard of, obviously, endangered species and the Endangered Species Act, which we will probably refer to, I'm gonna start throwing terms at you, as the ESA. This is the thing about Water World. There's a ton of abbreviations and acronyms, so you'll hear us talk about ESA, and you'll also hear us talk about the HCP, which specifically is the Habitat Conservation Plan. So the other thing I should tell you all is, if we start all of a sudden talking about stuff that is like completely foreign and you think we're up here speaking Mandarin, please wave your hands and let us know so that we can slow down and explain anything that we've missed or glossed over. So to start with, Bridget, since Bridget's the expert here, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about what it means for a species to be listed on the Endangered Species Act.
Sure. There we go. That sounds better. Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and certainly thanks to the DRC for hosting these events. I think this type of community engagement is fabulous, so thank you for that. So for species to be listed on the endangered species list, first just backing up, so the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1970, amended in 1973, unanimously passed by the Senate, which I think when we think of divided politics these days, that's not something we can envision, but it's a fabulous environmental law that we look back at with such pride. But the Endangered Species Act is an act that essentially protects species that are at risk of either being extirpated, a word that we use about being lost to a particular geography, or entirely lost to the system. So for a species to get put on the endangered species list, it's actually quite a process. And it's a federal rulemaking, which means that we put a notice out and we tell people, say, hey, we think that this species is in decline and we are concerned about it, and we're going to evaluate its status, meaning how many are they, what its threats are there things that are going to prevent it from staying on the landscape, and what's its likelihood of survival into the future. And so we do a very rigorous scientific analysis. We put that out for public comment. We also take the scientific analysis and we send that off to experts for a scientific peer review. We hold public meetings to ask people if they have information. Maybe we didn't know where all the species locations were, and there are other populations that would inform our decision. We evaluate all the comments that we get. We go through a final federal rulemaking, and a species gets either one of a couple different determinations. One, it's not warranted, meaning, nope, it does not meet the actual definition of a threatened or endangered species. It doesn't meet the criteria. Or it is a threatened species, or it is an endangered species. Threatened is sort of your first level of concern, and that means that it is at risk of becoming endangered, or it is an endangered species, which means it is at risk of going extinct. And so when we describe the endangered species status, we try to use an example of the emergency room. So species essentially, once they're on the endangered species list, you're in the emergency room. Your primary care doctor is not taking care of you anymore. So within the state of Oregon and all across the United States, the state Fish and Wildlife agencies, they manage the conservation and recovery of wildlife, fish and wildlife. But when species get put on the endangered species list, they fall under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or our counterparts that deal with marine species. So species like the Oregon spotted frog were put on the endangered species list because they had threats to their long-term persistence, and their numbers and their habitat have been impacted to such an extent that they can't survive without the protections that come with that listing.
So it's basically the tool that we have to help keep something from disappearing from the planet entirely, for the most part.
Yes.
In specific geographies.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Prevents extinction.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's a big job. So when was the Oregon spotted frog listed, and what sort of prompted that listing?
The Oregon spotted frog was put on the endangered species list in 2014.
Okay.
And it had been in decline for a long time prior to that. The spotted frog with a number of other species were under our sort of watchful eye for a long time. And we went through that process that I described and evaluated that it was at risk of becoming endangered. So it is a threatened species, not endangered. It's a threatened species on the endangered species list now.
Okay. So then the Habitat Conservation Plan, like how does that come into play with the Endangered Species Act, and, why does it matter? What does it need? What is it? Why is it needed?
Yeah, so when species are listed under the Endangered Species Act, they get certain rules that protect them, and certain provisions come into play that are that provide means to protect them from these threats that we've evaluated when we looked at whether they needed to be listed or not. And in particular, one of the rules, the one that people are most familiar with, is that once a species is on the endangered species list, you can't cause harm to that species or its habitat. There's this, I'm going to try to avoid all kinds of jargony words tonight, but the word that is in definition is that of take, meaning you're taking a species or its habitat. And the definition of take has like 30 words, which includes, hunt, shoot, pursue, kill, blah, 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 all the things that you can imagine that would prevent a species from persisting or harm to its habitat. So species gets put on the list, gets the protection of the Endangered Species Act. You can't harm or take the species or the habitat. So when that happens, a lot of times we have a lot of ongoing activities that have been going on for many number of years that now suddenly are finding themselves perhaps in conflict with the Endangered Species Act. And that's exactly really what happened here. So Lisa talked about the storage and diversion of water for the last 100 years and the settlements that white settlers moving into this area for farming purposes, et cetera. Well, those folks, stored and diverted water for many, many years. And as a result of that, regrettably, the spotted frog, the habitat for the spotted frog degraded. And we'll go into that in a little more detail in a few moments. But that ongoing activity suddenly found itself having some conflict with the Endangered Species Act, because storing and diverting the water essentially degraded the habitat in such a way that it could cause take or harm to the to the spotted frog in this case. So there's a few more pieces to the history of the start of the Deschutes HCP, which also included the salmon and steelhead reintroduction, which I think we talked about last time at the event, and other parts of the basin, but in the upper part of the basin, the long-term storage and delivery of water became in conflict with the Endangered Species Act when the spotted frog was added to the list of endangered species in 2014.
Okay. So yeah, I just want to bring attention to the term take, because it's a simple word, but I feel like the way in which it's used is like not the way that we're used to using it, but it basically does mean harm. It's really like anything that is harming the species, and we may refer to that as well. So you can add it to our ESA HCP take jargon for tonight. So let's talk a little bit about the HCP. Like, how does that come into play, and how is this part of the process?
Sure. So Congress recognized when species were getting added to the endangered species list that people have ongoing activities. People own timber farms, people divert water, cities build developments, and those activities can be in conflict with the conservation of endangered species.
And they almost always are. I mean, really, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's essentially, not to get into it, but I'm assuming
that is our day job.
I was going to say not many species get listed for like reasons that are outside of human activities, I would guess.
We could probably have a whole seminar on just that, but you're
We won't
right.
get into that,
You're
but
right.
yeah.
Yes, many human activities run into conflict
Yeah.
For purposes that are incidental.
Yeah.
And so, in this case, the Endangered Species Act actually got amended to develop a new part of the Endangered Species Act in the 1980s to allow for development of plans for people who have what we call otherwise lawful activity, meaning they legally do things like they go fishing or they divert water or they harvest timber on their property, things that people do for their livelihoods, for instance. But through doing that normal activity that they either had been doing or were about to start doing, they could cause harm to an endangered species. And they're in conflict with the Endangered Species Act and could be at risk of having some visits from our law enforcement, I'll just say. And so Congress added a section that allowed for the development of habitat conservation plans, which are for all non-federal entities, so states, private companies, municipalities, irrigation districts, anybody who's not a federal agency, basically. Federal agencies have a whole other compliance mechanism inside the Endangered Species Act, but tonight we're talking exclusively about non-federal entities. So habitat conservation plans were designed to provide a way for these entities to commit to particular types of conservation activities so long as those activities provided a conservation benefit to the species and that their harming of the endangered species was incidental, meaning not on purpose. Mm-hmm. So like in this case, the irrigators divert water. They're not trying to dewater the spotted frog's habitat or harm the fish. That's incidental to their activities. So that form of harm or take, incidental take, is allowed through these plans so long as the plan sufficiently addresses all of the impacts to what they do. So the spotted frog was added to the endangered species list. Water diversions were ongoing. The irrigation districts recognized that they had legal risk under the Endangered Species Act. They had liability that they wanted to address. They came to us and said, we want to take this on. We don't want to be like other places where people fight. We want to develop a plan. We want to control our own destiny. We want to protect our farmers. We want to design a conservation strategy that ensures that we can continue to deliver water to our patrons, but at the same time addresses the impacts that we have to the species in the basin. And so they started the development of the Deschutes Habitat Conservation Plan.
Okay, so an HCP is basically a voluntary plan that people enter into to try to figure out how to sort of mitigate their impacts, but at the same time allow them to continue doing whatever it was that they were doing that is incidentally causing harm to the species.
Well said.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, a lot of people think of it as an insurance policy.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
it's their policy so that they know they can continue to do and they don't continue to do it exactly the way they were doing it that was causing the harm. So we'll talk about that. But they can continue to legally divert water, but at the same time now providing the necessary conservation at the same time.
Okay.
And maybe one other just piece to add is when an HCP is finalized and the permits are all issued, the way that what the insurance policy provides the permittees, the people who got the permit, the irrigation districts, it gives them legal protection from lawsuits. So so long as they're following the plan, and so if we, the Fish and Wildlife Service, go through this whole planning process and we, analyze all of this, and I'll just say it took 12 years. It's not a quick process, millions of dollars of studies, hours and hours, days and days, months and months of negotiation, very long, hard decisions, very challenging technical analysis, et cetera. But here we are. We issued the permit. Now, if there are any challenges to irrigation districts, we, the federal government, have to defend the plan because we approved it. So from a liability standpoint, so long as the permittees are following the plan, they get the federal government defending them. And so that's part, like, what do they give, what do they get? That's kind of part of that trade-off, if you will. We get the conservation benefit, and they get protection from lawsuits. And maybe one more just little piece is that Endangered Species Act, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and many of our foundational environmental laws in the United States have what's called third-party citizen suit provisions, which means any person can challenge an activity or an entity if they think it's in violation of that particular act. So, my daughter sitting here in the front row could, and don't you do this, could challenge, could bring a citizen suit against a particular activity. That's a part of our bedrock of our environmental laws. So if in this case that an individual or an entity chooses to do that prior to the HCP, and this did happen in this basin, the irrigation districts had to defend themselves because they were causing this effect and they didn't have a permit. Fast forward, they have this permit now, and if there's a challenge to it, since we said it was good enough, we defend it. So I think that's an important point to share.
Yeah, that's a very important point to share. So, and again, I don't want to get too much off on a tangent on this, but I am curious, like, if an entity decided, they've been doing something that is causing take or incidental take to an endangered species, and they don't go the HCP route, like, can you give us like a little what happens? They get sued or what? Yeah, what's the other pathway?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that other path can go, but obviously like most entities, we would start with a conversation. Hi, I'm from the federal government, and I'm here to talk to you about your activities, and try to educate them, inform them about how they can come into compliance. But if an entity truly just has no interest in that, then they are potentially at risk of what we call Section 9 violation, another section of the Endangered Species Act that is unauthorized take. And then we do have law enforcement. That's a serious part of our organization. And then they can be prosecuted.
So in theory, it would be litigation and being held accountable for incidental take. Because, okay.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon for those types of activities, if brought to court without a potential resolution in the foreground, for those activities to be halted by a court through a preliminary injunction. They would say, like, hey, there's ongoing harm, there's no solution in sight, courts, please stop this activity before continued harm goes on.
Okay.
And then a preliminary injunction can be put in place, and then in this case, again, didn't happen this way, but it could be all water delivery is ceased.
So business as usual, and this is just more broadly speaking, business as usual could cease if if we're not doing the voluntary plan essentially to get the permit.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So let's dive into the Deschutes HCP specifically, and kind of we're going to hold all questions till the end unless it's a clarifying question. with a specific terminology or something.
It is. Can you just talk very briefly about? Hang on one second. We got a mic for you. Hi, I think it can be very confusing sometimes to hear about species being on the endangered species list when it's often a much more narrowly circumscribed entity, whether it's a subspecies or a DPS. So before we move on from the ESA listing, can you talk a little bit about that, specifically with the Oregon spotted frog?
Can we actually hold that?
Sure.
Just because I feel like raise your hand in the audience if you know about a subspecies versus a species.
Well, I guess
Okay. Well,
Here, I think I can address it quickly just by saying that not when we list a species, and I'm using that term at like a very broad scale, we don't. A lot of times we have to look at what the listed entity is, whether we're going to list a particular subspecies or various subspecies across a specific geography or across its entire range. So in many cases, we evaluate the listed entity depending on where the species exists versus the threats in different geographies. So in this particular case, the Oregon spotted frog is found from Klamath County to British Columbia. It is listed across that range, and it is one species. Yeah.
can you just explain for me then what a subspecies is? for the
Yeah.
other half of the audience?
Yeah, sure. So many times, for in Washington State, one of the listings that I worked on was the Mazama pocket gopher, and that was a lot of fun. It was a little gopher that ran around and dug holes in people's territories. But there were 5 subspecies, so they all basically look the same, but they're just genetically divergent in ways.
Okay.
So
then do those get listed
they
individually?
individually got
Okay.
listed by
All right.
their geographies, yes, by the
Okay.
boundaries of where they exist.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, really quickly, this is my, everybody's got to see the geography of where we are. We all know that we're in the Deschutes Basin. So now we're going to move ahead to talk about sort of the who, what, when, where, whys of the actual habitat conservation plan. So we're going to start with the who, and we've got the permittees. So yeah, Bridget, you want to tell us a little bit about who is engaged in this process? Who are the voluntary entities?
Sure. So the permittees in this case are the 8 member districts of the Deschutes Basin Board of Control. They are listed there. I try to do them alphabetically so I don't forget them, but I don't have to because they're on the screen today. But those irrigation districts store and divert waters from the Deschutes Basin, the Deschutes River and its tributaries, as well as into the Crooked River, and I'll go through that geography as well, and the city of Prineville, which does groundwater pumping activities. So the 8 member districts of the Deschutes Basin Board of Control, and all of the different irrigation districts are shown on that map in different colors. Mm-hmm. So you can see down there on the bottom right of the screen, you can see the different irrigation district names and the color blocks on that. And one thing to note is that they have different geographic boundaries, and so they all deliver water to their lands that are within their districts. And so each of the different irrigation districts have different places that they store and divert water from. So, for instance, Three Sisters Irrigation District is exclusively over outside of Sisters on Whitechoose Creek, and that has no sort of overlap with North Unit Irrigation District, which you can see up there on the north end of the district in Madras. And we can talk a little bit more about the different districts, but those districts decided after 100 years of being competitors to some extent, of all trying to store and divert waters of the Deschutes River, to come together to pool their resources and work together to develop a habitat conservation plan, which was a great idea because no one of them could really have done it alone. And I know DRC in particular has been a strong advocate of developing tools for moving water between districts. For those that came, I'm sure there's been a discussion, I know, early on with water rights and senior rights, junior rights, those who have stored water rights, meaning taking waters from the reservoir, versus live flow rights, just taking water from snowmelt. And then they all mix about, and so their ability for any one of the entities to design a conservation plan to address the species needs was very challenging. But having them all work together, they could move water between them and share water and transfer water. And then one entity would sort of take up one part of the conservation strategy in one geography and another in different areas. So the districts working together was a real asset for both them and for the conservation of the species.
Yeah. And so again, just for a terminology thing, these are referred to as the permittees. So they're the folks that actually receive the permit as a result of the HCP process. And just also to know, I don't think my pointer is necessarily working, so okay. I was going to say I'll do my best, but oh, no, there it is.
Whoa.
I have this cool little like zoom in thing.
Okay.
So I was going to point out like this
Yeah,
is the Three
there's
Sisters
Three Sisters,
Irrigation
yeah.
District, and then up here, was the North Unit Irrigation District.
Right.
So, okay. Thank you, Matt, for making that happen. Okay, so let's move on to, I believe it is the what. So what is covered?
Right. So some of the terminology here, we have the covered species, the covered lands, the covered activities. And so we're just walking through, these are the different components when an entity is developing a habitat conservation plan. They have to say who's getting the permit, for what activities, impacting what species and where. So it's sort of like the who, what, when, and where and why. So we, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, have a responsibility for the Oregon spotted frog and bull trout. Our colleagues over at the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries, you've heard them referred to in different ways, they have jurisdiction over Mid-Columbia, steelhead, and sockeye. And just quick fun fact for the Endangered Species Act, both we have two federal agencies that administer the Endangered Species Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service has jurisdiction over all the animals and plants that are that are basically land-based animals, and then for aquatic species, anything that spends more than half their life in fresh water. Those are all the ones that we have jurisdiction over. For some reason, Congress split it into two. There's many sort of anecdotes of why that happened, but National Marine Fisheries under NOAA, the weather people, they're a great organization. They have jurisdiction over anything that spends more than half their time in the marine environment. So whales, certain salmon species that spend more than half their time in the marine environment. So actually, in this case, the irrigation districts had to develop one plan, but they had to submit it to both of our agencies to get the habitat conservation plan approved by each of the agencies. So ours covers spotted frog and bull trout, and our colleagues at NIMS covers steelhead and sockeye.
Claire, hold on just a second. We're going to get you, are we going to do a mic, or is it a clarifying question?
It's not, I don't believe that's a brook trout. I don't think so. I'm not the fisheries expert, but that was taken by...
Fun fact, I don't know one fish from the other. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah. I did take the picture on the right. That is an Oregon spotted frog. I took that picture myself up in Crane Prairie Reservoir. And I will get the citation for which, where that picture of the fish came from, and follow up with you on that.
If you have better pictures of bull trout, we would love them. Please pass them along. You throw them even better. Thank you for doing that. We appreciate it.
I do appreciate that.
So in addition to the species, what are the activities that are covered? Because this is pretty important. This gets back to the what's causing the incidental take to begin with.
Sure. So the covered activities are any activity that actually causes harm to the species. And in this case, it's a list of activities all around water management. So that's the storage, release, diversion, pumping, and return of waters from the reservoirs and streams of the Deschutes Basin. And then, as I mentioned, the city of Prineville has groundwater management, pumping, withdrawals, and discharge back to surface water. So all of those activities in the natural water bodies where the endangered species are where the activities and what those activities are that are covered.
And can I just clarify that groundwater pumping is included because there's such a direct link between groundwater and surface water?
Yes.
And so by pumping groundwater, again, because the Deschutes Basin is a groundwater-fed system largely, it impacts surface water, which then impacts these aquatic species.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I had that right. So, Okay, so wow, I'm still not comfortable with the handheld mics after all these months. Okay, so now we're going to move into the when and the where. So this whole process, you said it took 12 years. Yeah.
Yeah, so these are complex plans, and it's a big basin. And like I said, we had 8 irrigation districts, each with their own irrigation district board that had to agree and approve the measures that each of the different districts would be responsible for. But yes. That's on the long side. Of course, we like to do things more efficiently wherever we can, and there was litigation that held it up for a little while in the middle of it, and that a bit of a detour. But yes, it took a long time. But at the end of 2020, we completed the planning process, and we approved the habitat conservation plan and issued what's known as an incidental take permit. So that's the actual insurance policy, if you will. We refer to this as the HCP, but it's really the permit that the districts obtained. So they develop the habitat conservation plan that makes the commitments of what they will do, and when we do an analysis to evaluate whether that's sufficient, then we issue them a permit, and we did that at the end of 2020.
And that permit is good for 30 years.
It is a 30-year permit,
Okay.
yes.
So
yes.
it's a 30-year permit, but it's also a 30-year plan.
Yes.
So it's
yes,
not,
there are measures that go all
Yep.
the way out for
so
many
it's not
years.
like day one, all of a sudden everybody has to change everything right away. It's really sort of, from my understanding of it, it sort of eases into things a bit.
Yeah, there's a number of measures that we designed with the many hours of biologist time that the irrigation districts hired, working with our experts and others to design a strategy for addressing the impact to the Deschutes. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, about how do you design a conservation strategy for an amphibian, a spotted frog in this case, that stating the obvious here, it's not a fish. It doesn't live in the river per se, like many other aquatic species that people have a lot of experience with. Frogs live in there. This is an entirely aquatic animal. It requires water it's in all of its life stages. It is native to this area. I've had folks ask that, is it native species? Absolutely, native species to Oregon. And it requires water for all its life stages. However, it lives in the adjacent wetlands of the river, not necessarily in the river proper. And so we're going to come to
We're going to talk
Okay.
more about that in just a
Okay.
second. And in fact, we're going to show you a lot of pictures to help. Actually, a picture paints 1,000 words, right?
Correct.
So we'll show you some photos of why it's a little bit challenging. But before we get there,
Okay.
let's go back to like the idea of like the where, which is like what are the covered lands, both for
Right.
for
Yes,
the
thank you.
permits.
So this is a map of the basin. The Deschutes River there is sort of the main line up the middle of the map. The yellow areas depict the actual quote covered lands, and that's where the endangered species are that the activities could impact. So the covered lands are generally the areas where the species are present first and foremost. And so I had some folks say like, well, what about all the canals? It's like, well, the species aren't in the canals, fortunately. But so those areas aren't part of the plan per se, where the actual covered lands are. And so all the areas depicted in yellow here, the upper reservoirs in the Upper Deschutes, Crescent Lake, Wickiup, Crane Prairie, those are all parts of the HCP, and then down the Deschutes, Tumalo, Crooked River out of Prineville, all the way down Three Sisters, White Shoes, all the way to the middle, Deschutes through Lake Billy Chinook down to the middle, the lower Deschutes, all the way out to the Columbia. That's all part of the plan area that all had to be analyzed.
Yeah, that's a big job. Now, so we're going to drill down a little bit into frog-specific covered lands.
Yeah, so in this particular, so this is the upper part of the basin. The top right of the picture there, that's Bend. So the spotted frog is actually now only in this basin is only found essentially from the Whitewater Park in Bend up into the upper lakes. Historically, we had samples all the way down to, or specimens, all the way down to Lower Bridge. And then we have other populations on the White River, up in on Mount Hood, and then elsewhere up into Washington. But currently in the Deschutes, the population only extends to Bend. And so the frog conservation strategy is essentially from Bend up. And you can see in here the purple areas. Those are all the areas that are part of the HCP. These are the same lands that were colored yellow in the previous map. And we show this map to kind of also depict the other areas where the spotted frogs are in our basin. So the covered lands are areas where the irrigation district's activities exist. So those activities basically start in the reservoirs where they're storing and releasing the water. But we have spotted frogs up in Hosmer and Davis Lake and some of the other high elevation lakes as well. So, but that's not part of the HCP because the irrigation district's activities have no role there. Those are natural lakes, and those they're outside of the HCP. But we thought we'd show them just to give an example of where spotted frogs exist beyond the HCP and the Deschutes.
All right. Can you talk us a little bit through the idea of a conservation strategy, which is a big part of the HCP?
Sure. I've got this sort of distilled down to these like simple little words on a page, but I brought my prop here, which is my short 30 pages of fine print of actually what the conservation measures look like. So conservation measures are the commitments. Those are the measures that the districts commit to in the plan. They're the requirements that they have to comply with to ensure that they're in compliance with their permit. And we'll get into permit compliance in a little bit, but so conservation measures, very specific. They essentially, for this plan, they're specific flow requirements or reservoir elevation levels that are required literally for every day for the next 30 years. So in particular, Wickiup Reservoir, it's like from, there's segments of the measure that address like in the winter we do this, and then in the spring for breeding we do that, and then in the rearing period we have the water held at these different levels at this time to allow for different activities, and so it moves through the water year, and it establishes very specific flow requirements in that entire geography for every different life stage of the covered species. And for the moment, we're talking about the spotted frog. Mm-hmm. And so the strategy for the spotted frog really is getting at the life history needs, which are frogs like shallow water to breed in. And so in particular, like we stabilize the flows or stabilize the level in Crane Prairie Reservoir. That has a pretty good population of Oregon spotted frogs. But historically, the irrigation districts, because they had water rights there, they could drain that in the summer and then fill it in the winter and drain and fill. And so when spotted frogs are breeding, they're trying to get into some submerged vegetation, and they deposit their eggs, and then those eggs hatch, and the young tadpoles, before they even have legs, are just sort of hiding in the vegetation, trying to not be eaten by great blue heron or fish or other species. And so you can imagine if the water is fluctuating rapidly, then either the eggs could be flushed out by the wind or by just the wave action of having a rapid decline in the volume. So we stabilize the reservoirs to hold the water constant during the breeding period and the rearing period, so that the frogs can complete their breeding cycle, let the frogs grow their legs, and then the irrigation districts start to pull the water out when the frogs have legs and they can move and evade predators better.
And this is specifically Crane Prairie.
That one's Crane Prairie. Yep.
Because it's really good habitat.
It's very good habitat, and it's the same concept applies to other sort of shallow areas where we try to stabilize the water at an elevation in the vegetation to allow for successful breeding. But Crane Prairie is a great example of that, and I'm pretty sure you have a picture of that. We can.
Yeah, let's go to that one.
But yeah, so this is what good habitat looks like up at Crane Prairie Reservoir. You can see the submerged vegetation here, and actually, I don't think there are any egg masses in there, but they would be just sort of like right in this forefront of vegetation in that sort of open area. I've got some pictures of eggs at the end I'll show you, but they just sort of lay their eggs in this shallow vegetation where it gets a little warm from the sun in the spring, and the spotted frog breeding season is just about to begin, and so it's always this. It's a little bit of a variable season depending on what kind of spring we have and what kind of late winter we have, and is Crane, or all these places are still under snow right now. But it's amazing, as soon as those areas begin to warm up and that snow melts, those frogs are breeding real quickly. So we're always trying to get up there to do the surveys at the right time. So that's Crane Prairie. Maybe let's go back to that. The other slide, one more if we could. And so these are the sort of the basic premises of the conservation strategy for the frog. Stabilize the water at particular times. Modify the timing of the releases so that we're not flushing tremendous volumes down while the frogs are breeding, or later in the season. So maybe I'll take a quick moment and talk about the frog life cycle if I could.
Yeah, I also just want to point out that these strategies in a lot of ways are somewhat sort of going back to emulating what the river did before we really started storing and diverting. Not that we're going to stop doing those things, but just a little bit of sort of evening out that hydrograph that we looked at the beginning. So
the goal is to try to mimic that natural system as best we can so the species can have an opportunity to recover.
Crane Prairie existed. I mean, it was...
Yeah, it was likely a big marsh.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So Lisa talked about the storage and the release of the water. So I'm going to quickly just walk through the spotted frog life cycle. So in the spring, I mentioned they breed, they lay their eggs in this shallow water, they rear into young tadpoles, they then grow legs and then start to move around, seek cover, feed. Young juveniles at that will start to disperse a little bit, but they really don't move very far. They like we do these kind of crazy scientific experiments where we like put little zip tie belts on them with little tracking devices to see how far they go. It's all for scientific purposes, and we have a permit for it. But we we actually have to issue ourselves permit to do these things as well. But we do because we need to understand, like, how far do they move? Do they move like a quarter of a mile, or do they move like 2 miles? Like what are their habitat needs? So we evaluate that. But back to their life cycle. So they go through the summer, they're in water the entire time, and then in the fall, they move into their overwintering habitats. And so when they're overwintering habitats, they sort of get down into like side channels where like beavers kind of cut through little side channels, or down in the lava. They sort of go down into these sort of like, not quite into a hibernation phase, but they just like go into this overwintering phase where they just kind of, don't move and kind of all like nest together.
Couch season.
Yeah, yeah, maybe. Our expert Jennifer O'Reilly is cringing as I say this, but nonetheless, but they need to be in water, and so and they stay in that overwintering habitat until the next spring when they come back out to breed, and so. Overlay the irrigation season on top of that, and if you're storing the water in the winter, you are potentially drying up those habitats because the water is not flowing in the river, you're storing it up in the Upper Deschutes, and so those habitats can get dewatered. And so one of the things we've had to do is really work with the irrigation districts to try and release water during the winter when they are not using it for irrigation purposes. And that actually was one of the main reasons that the HCP took so long to complete, because the storage and release, the release of water in the winter is a big impact to the farmers and to the irrigation districts, because they don't grow crops in the winter and they can't store the water in the winter closer to their fields. So when it is released in the water, it is basically storage that they don't have for next summer. Right. So let's take a look at some of those other pictures. So this is one of the really beautiful spotted frog habitats that's on one of these sloughs, which are the sort of back channels of the Deschutes River. Let's go to the upper pictures for a moment, though, just to kind of we'll come back to that one. So this is what the Upper Deschutes looks like in the winter when the river is, quote, turned off. So in the summer, the flow is extraordinarily high, right? Lisa showed that graphic at the very beginning. Extremely high volumes come out. Well, that has scoured the river to such an extent that the river channel itself is 20% larger than it historically was. And that is, if you remember anything, one of the key take-home messages is that the river is physically bigger than it was historically. So the amount of water that we put down it can no longer reach the vegetation, which is now further away. So let's take.
So a really important part of this whole process is not just the water, but also the restoration that needs to come with along with the water and stabilizing the flows to a certain extent.
Yeah, we have very ambitious restoration goals for the Upper Deschutes. But so here's an example of what the river looks like when it is flowing at a higher volume, so that it can inundate and come right up and adjacent to the vegetation. And then go ahead and show the next slide. So this is what it looks like when the river gets turned off. So if you are a frog trying to tuck into some of that vegetation and the river gets shut off, that's not a good situation for you. So the goal is to, over time, increase those flows in the winter so that there's not this rapid change from summer to winter, so that the frogs can can basically complete their life cycle and not be stranded into some of these habitats.
And along with that, do the restoration to help get the channel sort of back to, instead of it being such an oversized channel, basically have the submerged vegetation meet the waterway. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. And I love that you're like, we've been just on this like drum of the restoration, and I love hearing it back. That's wonderful.
It's
so
important.
Yes, essentially, because the river is so much physically larger, like I said, is the natural amount of water can no longer inundate the vegetation because it's further away. So you have the same amount of water, but it doesn't spread onto the wetland like it used to, because it's pushed away. And in the summer, with that great volume of water, new vegetation isn't going to grow back because it's buried, it's submerged under the river.
And I just want to point out that would happen even if we all packed up right now and left the Deschutes Basin and moved away and ceased all activities. The river would still be oversized the channel would still be oversized for the river, for the amount of water that is naturally occurring in the river. So getting the submerged vegetation closer to the actual river itself is a huge part of this equation.
And we have great plans for that. So
yes.
Yes. So maybe just keep moving through some of these slides quickly. So here's an area again, submerged vegetation. This is what it looks like when the river is off, if you will. This is an important breeding habitat, and so one of the conservation measures I mentioned is modify the timing and the flows. So right about now, starting in about a week and a half, April 1st, we have the irrigation district start to bring the irrigation, turn the river back on, if you will, bring the flows back up so that this and other important breeding sites look more like the slide before it, where the river is actually in contact with the vegetation and the frogs can breed in the habitat successfully, as opposed to being in this shallow mud where they can be predated on. And like I said, there's lots of birds and other animals that want to eat them. And
Oops, I'm going the wrong way.
That's
Sorry.
okay.
Let's, I think we're switching gear. Oh, there's
So those-
a picture of
those are the egg masses. That's what they, this is a very zoomed in look.
It is. I think it's a really cool picture.
I love this picture also. This was one by, I think, a professional photographer who did this for a film that we made, which was excellent. But you can see the tiny little, the tiny little frogs inside each of those egg masses, or each of those little eggs. Okay, you want
Now
me to
I'm
move
moving
on?
us along.
Okay.
Well, not you.
Yeah.
I don't. Not you specifically, but just in the interest of time and being able to take the questions that I know exist,
Yeah.
I think I'll move us on to bull trout.
Okay. I will just say by closing, though, I do want to hit that restoration piece, which is the water alone is not sufficient to address the problems in the Upper Deschutes. And part of the strategy for for the spotted frog is, modifying that timing and movement of the water, but also developing a conservation fund where we can do restoration projects. And there's a $150,000 fee per year that the irrigation districts, adjusted for inflation, that goes into a fund to start to do restoration work. And we've already begun that work with our key partners, with Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, and we're with different grants to do different types of restoration work. In the short run, that's about removing bullfrogs and other competitive species. In the long run, it's going to be about doing some of these physical habitat plantings and such when the flows change. So the flows change over time. The winter flow goes up, the summer flow comes down into a more stable hydrograph in time.
And if you want a sneak peek at what that might look like, for those of you that did not catch last month's Raise the Deschutes, we did a seminar on the reintroduction of fish, and we talked a lot about Deschutes Creek and the restoration efforts there. And even if you don't watch the seminar, if you go online and look at the slide deck, there's some really cool pictures of sort of the before and after of what is possible with some of that restoration work, with the combination of adding water and the restoration work. So yeah. Little mini plug. Now we'll move on to bull trout really quickly.
Right. So bull trout. By comparison, way easier conservation lift from a perspective of negotiating a strategy. So bull trout, in not everywhere, but in the Deschutes Basin, are actually in a very healthy status. So the Metolius, can you point to that? Yeah, the Metolius is right up in there. The Metolius is a very successful spawning location for. There you are. Yep, there you go. Very successful bull trout spawning area. And so areas, the irrigation, the storage and release of irrigation water, while has an impact on bull trout, specifically in the Crooked River and in areas in Deschutes Creek, it didn't have the same sort of really challenging conservation delta or conservation lift that we had to negotiate. So of course, very important species, and also when we negotiate for bull trout, we think about the other species, the salmon and steelhead reintroduction by the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs and our partners at ODFW, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and others. But from a conservation perspective, this was the easier part of the conservation strategy. So this map, the purple on the map is where bull trout are now, and the red in other areas are historic, both resident Dolly Varden as well as anadromous bull trout. But currently they are found in those purple areas, and we designed conservation strategy for them. And probably goes without saying, because we're showing maps that depict this, but interestingly, and this is not always the case with habitat conservation plans, the geography of the covered species do not overlap. So sometimes in a plan we'll have marbled murrelets and owls, and and they're all right on top of each other, and some of the conservation strategy for one species can benefit another. And while that's true broadly for species, in this particular case, we had to have different measures in different places because the species were in different locations.
Which is probably both a good thing and a bad thing, depending on the species. Because if you have two species and they have somewhat conflicting.
In this case, it worked out for the better. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. So we have. I think you can move on here. So we have the conservation strategy for bull trout is really about providing water all year long in the Crooked River. The Crooked River really has. There's a lot going on there. It's a complicated management system because it's not just the irrigation districts, it's the irrigation districts and the Bureau of Reclamation. And boy, this could get to like a crazy, jargony ESA talk, and I'm not going to do that. But I'll just say that because there's typically, and the last couple of years have been very challenging with drought on the Crooked River, but typically in the Crooked River, irrigation waters are in the Crooked River during the summer, and it was the winter that was the limiting period for fish. And so our focus had been primarily on trying to ensure that in times of low water, that there would always be water in the winter. And we negotiated that to ensure that there would never be less than a 50 cubic feet per second, or CFS, flow in the winter in the Crooked River. And frankly, when we negotiated that, we thought, when we look at the historical hydrographs and the hydrology and the system and what the basin produces, we thought that looks like we're going to trigger that measure like maybe 2 years out of 10, and didn't really seem like it was going to be as robust. Well, here we are 2 years into it, and we have had that measure in place for the first 2 years. So the Crooked's been very challenging, but I will say without the habitat conservation plan, we would have had flow in the Crooked River of 10 CFS or less for the last 2 winters, which is the really essential time for salmon and steelhead in particular, that have been reintroduced coming back into the system in November. So the plan requires minimum flows in the winter, and we're so glad we have them, because the last couple years have really proven to us how essential those have been. A whole bunch of other things on leasing water in stream and protecting flows and screening diversions, et cetera. But the big gain over there was the winter flows, and like I said, we've had to do those the last couple of years.
Yeah, and again, plug for the last seminar where we talked about how all these tools work together to actually achieve the objectives, which we've done with Waichus Creek, and so we continue to do that work in partnership to try to make a win-win for all the partners at the table. So the last question I think I have for you is, after 12 years, you issued the permit. It's good for 30 years, but obviously the work is not done. It's definitely not done on the part of the permittees, and it's not done for you. So how are you ensuring it's all happening? What's happening now? What's keeping you busy now?
Yeah. I remember when the permit was signed, and we, patting each other on the back, sent the copy of the permit off to the irrigation districts, and I was like, now the work really begins. And
it's like writing a grant.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps. So there's a number of requirements that come with the plan. So one, they have to do everything that's, they have to do all the fine print of all the measures. They have to report that. They have to monitor that. They have to ensure that those flows, I said, every day for the next 30 years at a variety of gauges all across the basin. Every single one of those requires reporting and monitoring to us, the Fish and Wildlife Service. It also requires instant 12-hour notification if anything is beyond, anything is out of compliance. And sometimes that's because of a gauge, like the outlet at Wickiup Reservoir sometimes gets plant growth on it, and it looks like the flows are not at the volume that they're supposed to be at, and we can see it online. All the gauges are online. Again, they're all. We'll show you a quick place later where you can see we have tools we've built where any member of the public can go in and say, I care about this area. What are the requirements for this area? Oh, okay, well, what is the measurement today? So you can kind of look at all of that yourself. But if there's an issue where either there's some incident that occurs, or somebody has somebody goes crazy and turns the gauge in a way that they're not, or turns the valve in a way they're not supposed to, they have a requirement to report that within 12 hours to us. So if they're outside of their allowable deviation. Now we know gauges have errors and things can occur, so every single one of the measurements or the metrics have an acceptable range of deviation, because gauges have an inherent level of precision that we expect. So, but there's a report at the end of every year about compliance with every single one of the measures. We have a monthly call that I'm so glad we put that in. We'd started that prior to the HCP, and we ensured that it was included as a measure, and it's a requirement of every month where we get together with all the districts, Water Resources Department, and ourselves, and we go over where are we at? What's the flow? What's going on? And the irrigation districts have hired consultants that do this work for them. They do all the biological reporting. They have built tools that literally go out to all of the river gauging and the reservoir elevation websites, and sort of sweep that data into tools that evaluate compliance with the HCP, and we evaluate every gauge every month on where we are and what month in the plan and what the flow is supposed to be. And we talk about what's coming. Like right now, we've been talking about irrigation season's coming. When are you planning to turn on? What is the weather like? Are we going to need, are the frogs out there yet? So there's all this real-time coordination that occurs constantly. And I'm so glad we did that because over time, we are learning the needs of the irrigation districts just to understand like what makes them tick. What are they trying to do? How are they trying to deliver water? And they learn what we're looking for from a biological response. We're like, wow, the flow is at 1,200 CFS, but if it was at 1,300 CFS, we'd be sure we'd have water in East Slough, and that's a really important place at this time of year. And they're like, obviously those are all requirements in the plan now, but we try to help them understand what places are important to us and where and how much water it takes to get into those. And so having them understand what biological outcomes we're looking for has made us truly actually partners in conservation as we implement this plan.
So this is literally the opposite of a plan that sits on a shelf that nobody looks at. This is like a plan that everybody every day is looking at and referring to and implementing going forward. And the bonus for the irrigation community is that some certainty.
Yeah, so irrigation, one of the things that we always, as we work with any business interest that we hear is that businesses like certainty. They like predictability. They like to be able to know their risk so they can manage their risk and they can plan accordingly. And in this case, the irrigation districts have certainty that they can deliver water so long as they're in compliance with their plan. Now, again, first 2 years, as soon as we signed this plan, crazy drought for the first 2 years made it a little bit on the challenging side. We were hoping we might have like a little bit of an easier, opportunity to get started. But yes, the plan provides certainty to the farmers so that they can go about their normal business without the threat of litigation, so long as they're implementing the plan.
All right. So I think we are going to very quickly move into questions because it is that time. But I just want to point everyone to this pretty amazing website that Fish and Wildlife put together. And actually there are, for those of you that are tech savvy, there are these little QR codes on your table, which if you try to take a picture with your phone of that QR code, it will direct you to this website. And there are two things in this website that I think are really, really cool. One of them is a story map, which I don't know how many people have familiarity with the story map, but basically it's a really cool graphic story that sort of relays a lot of the information that we talked about tonight. And then the other thing is that web application. If you click on web application, you'll have to click a box that says that you agree, but then it lets you into essentially a really cool, I think GIS-based system that if you hover over different parts of the Deschutes Basin, again, going back to what Bridget just said, if you have a particular interest in a particular area of the basin and you hover over that area, it will pop up the actual conservation measures that are in this document, as well as links to like all of the actual real-time gauges where they're pulling the data from in terms of like what the flows look like. So it's a really cool way for you all to like get more familiar with exactly what is going on like a very specific geographic level. And I would all encourage you to do that for those of you that are interested.
And the HCP library.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm so sorry. Yes, there are thousands of pages.
Yes.
Literally. I mean, I think the HCP was...
It's like 800 pages. I know.
Just 800
when you
pages.
said it's
Light
like
reading.
it's not a plan that sits on the shelf. That's why I excised the actual measures, because those are the part that we need every single day. But the plan itself is very long.
Yeah.
But yeah, each one of those different links will take you to a bunch of stuff. If anybody has an interest in pursuing some of that and they run into trouble, you can reach out to me. I'll walk you through how to operate that web application. It's really a cool tool, and we're pretty proud of it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I did not mean to gloss over the library. But yes, there
okay. That's
are
where
literally thousands of pages of documents in there. The actual HCP is in there for those of you that want some light bedtime reading. Let's see. So I just wanted to kind of come back around to some take-home messages for this evening. So the HCP is a tool. It's not the tool, but it is a tool to help us move towards a more natural hydrograph. Again, going back to the beginning of the talk and what we've done with the hydrograph. Obviously, the Endangered Species Act very much focuses typically on single species management in this case, or multiple species at one time. That is one of its major criticisms. But at the same time, obviously, when you are working on restoring habitats, there are other benefits. Ancillary. I can never say that word.
Ancillary.
Thank you.
But also
those
like
benefits.
we see it as indicator species.
Right.
So as we restore the Deschutes River for the spotted frog, the entire aquatic community and the ecosystem is literally coming back to life. So
Yeah.
it has many benefits.
Yes, and obviously it's challenging for the farmers in the basin, but it does provide some certainty for them to continue their activities with storing and diverting water. And I will say that we have some neighbors to the south where there is no HCP in place in another basin that we're all probably familiar with. And there's a lot of litigation, and there's a lot of examples of no water being delivered at all because of the endangered species issues. So while it's not a perfect tool, it's definitely a tool that helps to provide some of that certainty for the agricultural communities. This HCP work is driving a lot of the work that's going on in the Deschutes Basin. Obviously, we're well aware of that work, and it's sort of in some ways the catalyst. I don't know, again, for those of you that came to the fishery introduction talk, we had the catalyst for the fishery introduction was very much the relicensing of the Pelton Round Butte facility. And so in a lot of ways, the HCP can kind of be seen as a catalyst for a lot of the restoration work that is going to be happening very, very shortly in the Upper Deschutes Basin. So,
Have you talked about I know this is a whole other topic, but the irrigation piping?
yes.
Because of the requirements of the HCP over time step up. So the flows start low, and then in every year they get greater for what they have to provide in the habitats. And currently and historically, the irrigation canals that divert the water, 40 to 60% of that water is lost in conveyance. So from the time it leaves the river to the time it hits the farm, you're losing 40 to 60% of it in this porous, basalt that we have out here. So a lot of the irrigation districts are piping those canals and returning that saved water back to the streams. And so the idea is that conservation strategy aligns well with restoring the flows in the Deschutes. And because they have an HCP and because they have made these commitments, they sort of went to the front of the line for funding. And so they've already received, in our basin alone, $170 million since 2017 for piping and planning for piping. So serious investment.
Well, it's almost like I planted that because our next talk is actually going to be talking about irrigation modernization. I actually did not plant that little plug with Bridget, but yeah, we are going to talk about that next month. And it is one of the tools in the toolkit. And as Bridget said, the HCP, as the catalyst, has helped us help galvanize funding. So, and then, there is always, though, the need to balance HCP priorities with all of the other priorities in the basin, which is very much the day-to-day work of the DRC and many of our partners. We definitely don't want to leave anyone out. We are working hand in hand to try to get the water to the farmers that have the junior water rights in the northern part of the basin. So we're very much working all the time to try to meet, as we kind of refer to it, the three legs of the stool, the environment, agriculture, and cities and communities. So with that, I think we're gonna take questions. So we have a mic that's gonna rove around the room. So raise your hand and our mic walker will walk to you with a microphone so that you can state your question. Thank you for being patient in the back of the room because I saw you had your hand up a little earlier.
All right. So I guess, in considering the increase in flows, like when you said turn on the river, okay? I mean, I've been out Deschutes recreational homesteads, and I've seen like the water you could almost watch it go up the dock, okay? But doesn't that also increase the depth of the channel when you release that much water? So if you have such a rapid release of water, you're not only deepening the channel and widening the river, now you're making it harder for those surface waters to get off into those shallow areas in the wetlands. So now how much more water do you have to let out to get to the wetlands when you've deepened that channel by several feet?
Yeah, and again, there is no amount of water, I don't think, that will fix the problem at this point, which is why the restoration piece is so important. Sorry.
Yes, no, that's great. But no, that's how we got to where we are. And so the goal is to not have those summer flows as high. And and a couple of things. There are provisions that require ramping rates, meaning how fast and how slow the elevations can go up and go down to prevent further degradation there. But over time, as we've said, the winter flows go up to higher flows, and the summer flows get capped and have to come down. So we won't have those high summer erosive flows in the future. So
That one photograph you had is Ohio State Park.
yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yep, it's a very important place.
All right, hands again for people that have questions. There's one right there, one right here, and a couple over here. So,
Hi, thank you for this. I was just curious if there's any kind of consideration on the data center in Prineville and their water usage, and also the proposed chip plant in Redmond.
Those, yes, to get immediately to your question. A lot of that is reclaimed water that they're using in those locations, and that's part of the water supply of the city of Prineville and partly why they are included in the plan. So they pump groundwater at certain times of the year and then replenish that later, and they're also building an aquifer storage and recovery plant to allow for the recycling of that water, but that water use is actually well within their allotted amount. So that, while it looks like a lot of water to us, and we all, we pay a lot of attention to it, it was all well within the allotted water for the plan.
okay, got a couple right here.
My question, I have a couple of questions about the frogs, because I love frogs. They're so cute. But one of the questions I have is, have you noticed any change or increase in the frog survival since you have implemented this HCP? And the second part of the question is, do you have an expected length of time since the implementation of that those frogs could come off that endangered species list?
Oh, just thank you so much. Perfect questions. One, thank you for loving frogs. We love frogs too. Two things. One, some of the HCP measures we started implementing early as early conservation measures, partly as a result of litigation, but partly as a result of things that we knew were the right things to get started on. So the measures up at Crane Prairie Reservoir were implemented in 2016 and have been implemented ever since. And that's that sort of stabilizing that flow so that or stabilizing that reservoir level. And as a result of that, we saw for the first 5 years, the numbers continue to increase from, a few hundred egg masses to, I think over 800 or 900. But then with the last couple years, the drought have kind of knocked that down a little. Now, part of that is a little bit confounded by Crane Prairie and some of those upper basin breeding sites. Turned out they're pretty hard to get to in early April. And so there's snow on the ground. We need snowmobiles to get in there, or there's no access because in the winter, actually we get a lot of down wood and we can't get to the breeding sites. So it's a little bit, we don't have a 100% perfect survey approach there because of the weather and the conditions every year. So we think actually last year we might have, because if you remember last year we had that crazy late spring. First it was warm in March, and then we got like rain and snow into April.
Yeah, we had winter in the spring.
Yeah, we had, sprinter, as we call it in my house. And so that sort of confounds sometimes our ability to get an accurate count, which is why we go back year after year after year to make sure that we're trying to address those years where we may not have an accurate count. But the drought over the last couple of years, we did see a dip in the frog population up there. Having said that, it takes many years really to get a good trend over time. And so we're a little reticent to say like, yay, it's working, just because we want to be cautious and ensure that the data really tell us that. But for that one geography where we've been implementing that measure the longest, we saw the strongest response to that. To your second question, how long is it going to take? In addition to the HCP, the Fish and Wildlife Service also just released the Oregon Spotted Frog Recovery Plan, and that is a separate plan altogether. That's a document that we outline what it takes to go from being on the endangered species list to off. And that's out for public comment right now. I'm happy to show people how to access that. Public comment period closes on May 1st, and but in that we lay out all the different strategies that are necessary. And again, the spotted frogs occur from the Klamath Basin to British Columbia and have slightly different threats across the entire range. And so we have very specific recovery implementation strategies in each of the different basins across that range, designed to specifically address the threats in that basin. And for anybody who wants to get involved in spotted frog recovery, come talk to me. That'd be great.
There's a question right there, and then I think there's one a couple over here.
Hi, I'm here representing the Central Oregon Bitterbrush Broads, Great Old Broads for Wilderness. The concern I have is we have to look at drought, and when we're looking at the Crooked River in particular, when it dropped down to 10 CFS, I'm sorry, that's boiling fish. So that plant's not working. And the other concern I have is so with with climate change, we're also looking at what's going to happen with our wetlands. And so we're going to continue to see, like you had shown, of there's not water going into the wetlands. So I know you primarily focused on spotted frog tonight, but we have to look at the other species and the fish, and how the frogs, the fish, how they're going to survive. And so that's the other concern I have with this whole thing is how is climate change being brought into this whole plan? So, we have a 12-year plan, and that's great. But, I don't see us getting out of drought in the next 12, 15 years. So how is the HCP going to address that? Thank you.
Yeah, so the HCP is a 30-year plan, and one of the primary approaches to addressing climate change, first and foremost, was what we evaluated we did a lot of hydrologic modeling to evaluate what the potential was for changes, but the most important, getting right to your question about what are we going to do about it, the HCP says that no matter what happens, the species get the water first. So the conservation strategy, despite the volumes that are available, give preference to the species. Now that's a bitter pill sometimes for the farmers to swallow, but that's what the plan says. And so with respect to your comment on the Crooked River last year, the Crooked River, as you know, flows out of Prineville Reservoir, and the storage in Prineville Reservoir last year was the lowest it had ever been historically as a result of drought. And so we had to prioritize what was the best use of that limited volume of water. And when we looked at when the species of concern, the endangered species in our case, but also red band trout and others, when and where they are in the system, that 6-week period from mid-September to the end of November was the period of the least presence of those species in that geography. And in order to save water, to ensure we had that higher flow for the winter, we had to make that difficult choice. None of us liked that. We're biologists. We don't like that either. But that was a difficult choice that we had to make to ensure that we would have water for the winter. And in addition to that, one of the items that we obtained by doing that was we have this spring now from rains from this winter. A bucket of water, as we refer to it, a 3,000 acre-foot bucket of water that we will use to help the salmon and steelhead when they're outplanted for this year's reintroduction. We will be doing what we call pulse flows to help them migrate out of the system so that they can begin their life cycle. So we were was very challenging. We did not, again, nobody likes doing that. But when we analyzed the situation and the volume available, we had to make the tough choice about when and where we thought the water would provide the maximum conservation benefit. And for us, with the species that we have responsibility for, that was prioritizing the winter. I know, and historically, the Crooked River went dry in the summer. Yeah.
So those of you that have questions in the room, I'm going to encourage you to raise your hand really high so James can see it, because he's in the back with the microphone. And then in the meantime, we're going to pivot really quickly while he gets to the folks that have questions in the room. Again, keep your hands up so he can see you. There's one here and one there. We're also just going to pivot really quickly to an online question, which is like, what's the deal? What's the program with dealing with, or how are we handling non-native predator species that are problems? For
I was happy to see that. So bullfrogs and non-native predatory fish are both a very significant threat to the Oregon spotted frog. We identified that as when we listed the frog, that it wasn't just water, it was invasives. Bullfrogs are very pernicious. They eat a lot of spotted frogs. And so we have experts who go out and remove bullfrogs, and that's part of the Conservation Fund. We fund projects to go remove bullfrogs and non-native fish from Crane Prairie and other places. And that's sort of some of our early year strategy. While the flows are coming up and we're designing the physical restoration, we're going after these other threats by removing the predators from the system. So appreciate that.
All right, looks like Ellen's got the microphone here.
So the Center for Biological Diversity has filed a notice to sue you guys in Bureau of Reclamation because they don't feel the HCP is adequate. So what do you see as the future for the HCP? Because we've been talking about certainty and things like that. So what happens next, and what do you think is going to happen?
You probably don't have a crystal ball, and and Bridget also probably can't talk too much about the notice of intent to sue. So
there are certain limitations, but let me say that we as a employee of the government, which many folks in this room are or were, we know that we make decisions and we seek input on those, and we do our best to balance the many perspectives and implement the law as written, et cetera. And yet there are times when folks don't agree with those decisions. And so we typically reach out and try to engage in communication to resolve those issues in the most amicable way possible, which we are doing. And so we're hopeful that that's the route that this will go. And in this particular situation, it's us who have to have those conversations, and because we made the decision. So I am optimistic. I think that folks that I think there are folks, no matter what sort of perspective you bring to this, people are very passionate, whether it's from a conservation perspective or a concern for people's livelihoods, and we take that all very seriously, and we just try to engage with them to find that area of commonality and resolve those issues as best we can. So it's probably as far as I'm allowed to go.
it's great. And if you have a crystal ball, or find out where we can get one.
So I was curious, with the lower spring flows and lower summer flows as well, what's the overall plan that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has for the effects that has on wetlands? Like, for example, in the Sun River area along the Little Deschutes, I survey a crosswater golf course, which historically has had large populations in wetlands that were inundated by the Little Deschutes, and the last 2 years we haven't had any egg masses in those wetlands that used to have a very steady population but no longer get inundated, and that habitat is no longer viable.
Can I ask if that's a drought issue, or if
It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a really important area. The Sun River area, the Little Deschutes, is a really important area for spotted frogs, and this is one of the things that we really have to balance. That like we have. Some folks who think the plan isn't aggressive enough early enough, and yet there are places like Sun River that have had very robust populations of spotted frog. Most of that has been managed over the years with weirs in that geography where the water is stabilized at elevations that allow it to be allow the vegetation to be inundated, and so. The drought over the last few years has absolutely impacted those geographies, but we're mindful of the fact that in the long run, as the winter flows go up and the summer flows come down, some of those weirs in Sun River will need to be modified to reestablish at a level so that the water will will continue to inundate that vegetation. So I know there's some, we've already started talking about some restoration. That's sort of some of the early year work that we're thinking of. And I'm sure we'll be following up with you on how to help us find those specific areas. And I'm sure you're already in contact with Jen. Yeah. But yeah, the drought is probably the real driver of that for the last couple of years, but it's given us a view of what it's going to look like in the out years. And so, nothing's without cost. We say it's like, we call this the ultimate push down pop-up system. You can be fixing things in the upper basin by dropping those winter flows or increasing the winter flows and dropping the summer flows, but that has a consequence somewhere else. And so when a lot of times folks will say, like, they get really hung up over one particular area, like, you didn't get to certain flow, or it needs to be this in this area. It's like we have to manage the entire geography and the whole life cycle of the species, and ensuring that we're not causing harm in one area by fixing another has been extraordinarily challenging with this species. And so Sun River is one area that we're keenly focused on for the long term. As we sort of fix the Upper Deschutes, we have to make sure we don't harm that population there. So it's a balance.
It's like whack-a-mole. I know, sorry. That's probably totally not a good expression to use.
Yeah, I think there's a few more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time because we're at closing, and so I would imagine we can stick around for a few minutes to answer questions. But I just wanted to reflect on a few comments. First of all, I think you've all seen endangered species issues tear apart communities, the spotted owl conflict in Oregon and Washington. And so this, I think, is one of the reasons it's so important, is like we chose the collaborative route. It's not perfect, but I think it's holding the community together, which is so important. One of the other reasons we brought this to you tonight is because it is really driving a lot of the work in the basin, in the Upper Deschutes specifically, but also in the Crooked and Wachus. It's also not, and it's been a catalyst where we probably wouldn't be seeing the restoration we're seeing in the Upper Deschutes. There just wasn't a lever for that until this, and so it's a really powerful tool. It's also not the end-all, be-all perfect solution for the Deschutes, and so the question on the Crooked River, the Crooked is really challenging, and there's Chinook salmon habitat issues that aren't being addressed. And the work of the DRC and other partners and the tribes specifically is to actually try to, figure out the HCP species benefits, but also make sure the rest of the basin is whole. That includes like the Middle Deschutes for red band trout. So this is the work that we're all doing, but I think the HCP, Bridget used to call it the first rock in the jar.
The big rock in the jar. You fill it up after that.
Fill it up after that. And so that's what we're working on. So we really appreciate, I think you did a fantastic job of taking a really dense, process and like making it digestible for you all. So I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to make those comments. We'll be around. Appreciate the attention. Shameless plug, we have a fundraiser at the DRC and a community river celebration on May 4th called River Feast. And so if anybody wants to come and just celebrate the work, and we would welcome you to do that. You could find that on our website. And with that, I think we'll close it out and thank our presenters, and we'll be around if you want to chat.
And
Thank you.
Plug for the next one?
yeah, plug for the next one. I believe the next Raise the Deschutes, we are going to talk about one of the big tools in the toolkit that's helping us to collaboratively work on these issues, and that's irrigation modernization. So I believe that's going to happen on April 24th, if memory serves. So yeah, we hope that those of you that have tuned in will continue to tune in. Thanks for coming.